Heavenly Father, we again open your word knowing that through it you communicate yourself to us, both your glory and also your plan for redemption. We ask now that as we look into your word, as we contemplate what it means to suffer and to suffer what we would consider unjustly, that you would give us perspective and understanding. So, Lord, may the Spirit open hearts and minds to be attentive to your word. In your name we pray. Amen. Starting in Job 11. Job 11, verse 1. Then Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, should a multitude of words go unanswered, and a man full of talk be judged right? Should your babble silence men, and when you mock shall no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than the heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes through it in prisons and summons the court, who can turn him back? For he knows worthless men. When he sees iniquity, will he not consider it? But a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. If you prepare your heart, you will stretch out your hand toward him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not injustice dwell in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure and will not fear. You will forget your misery, and you will remember it as waters that have passed away. And your life will be brighter than the noonday. Its darkness will be like the morning. And you will feel secure because there is hope. You will look around and take your rest in security. You will lie down, and none will make you afraid. Many will court your favor, but the eyes of the wicked will fail. All the ways of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last. Then Job answered and said, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these? I am a laughingstock to my friends. I, who called God and he answered me, a just and blameless man, am a laughingstock. In the thought of one who is at ease, there is contempt for misfortune. It is ready for those whose feet slip. The tents of robbers are at peace, and those who provoke God are secure, who bring their God in their hand. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of heaven, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. Does not the ear test words as the palate tastes food? Wisdom is with the aged, and understanding in length of days. With God are wisdom and might. He has counsel and understanding. If he tears down, none can rebuild. If he shuts a man in, none can open. If he withholds the waters, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the land. With him are strength and sound wisdom. The deceived and the deceiver are his. He leads counselors away stripped, and judges he makes fools. He looses the bonds of kings and binds the waistcloth on their hips. He leads priests away stripped and overthrows the mighty. He deprives of speech those who are trusted and takes away the discernment of the elders. He pours contempt on princes and loosens the belt of the strong. He uncovers the deep out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. He makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and leads them away. He takes away understanding from the chiefs of the people of the earth and makes them wander in a trackless waste. They grope in the dark without light, and he makes them stagger like a drunken man. Behold, my eyes have seen all this. My ears heard it and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. As for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. Hear now my argument, and listen to the pleadings of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out, or can you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely rebuke you if in secret you show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you, and the dread of him fall upon you? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes, your defenses are defenses of clay. Let me have silence, and I will speak, and let come on me what may. Why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. This will be my salvation, that the godless shall not come before him. Keep listening to my words, and let the declaration be in your ears. Behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right. Who is there who will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. Only grant me two things, that I will not hide myself from your face. Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not dread of you terrify me. Then call, and I will answer. Or let me speak, and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgression and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? Will you frighten a driven leaf and pursue dry chaff? For you write bitter things against me and make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in the stocks and watch all my paths. You set a limit for the soles of my feet. Man wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. Man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me into judgment with you? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one. Since his days are determined and the number of his months is with you, and you have appointed his limits that he cannot pass, look away from him and leave him alone, that he may enjoy, like your hired hand, his day. For there is hope for a tree if it be cut down, that it will sprout again and that its shoots will not cease. Though its root grows old in the earth and its stump dies in the soil, yet at the scent of water it will bud and put out branches like a young plant. But a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last, and where is he? As waters fail from a lake and a river wastes away and dries up, so a man lies down and rises not again. Till the heavens are no more, he will not awake or be roused out of his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath be past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my service I would wait till my renewal should come. You would call, and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands. For then you would number my steps. You would not keep watch over my sin. My transgression would be sealed up in a bag, and you would cover my iniquity. But the mountain falls and crumbles away, and the rock is removed from its place. The water wears away the stones. The torrents wash away the soil of the earth. So you destroy the hope of man. You prevail forever against him, and he passes. You change his countenance and send him away. His sons come to honor, and he does not know it. They are brought low, and he perceives it not. He feels only the pain of his own body, and he mourns only for himself. Zophar speaks the least out of Job's three comforters in the two cycles in which he participates. But his speeches are also the most immediately directed to Job in an accusatory way. And in his speeches, he's not going to appeal, as Eliphaz did, to mystical experience or to tradition, as Bildad did. Rather, he's going to appeal on what he considers to be a well-reasoned logic or theology. And that's based upon what he thinks are self-evident realities in what he sees happening in the world. And he's going to argue that God always punishes unbelievers and that punishment is swift. In his first speech, we can divide it into three main parts. Verses 1 through 6, three main parts. Verses 1 through 6, he gives an accusation against Job. Verses 7 through 12, he exalts the wisdom of God. And then in verses 13 through 20, he calls for Job to repent. Zophar is also, as I said, by far the least conciliatory of Job's friends, because whereas Bildad and Eliphaz start off their speeches gently, trying to appeal to Job, and they progressively get more harsh as the speeches go on, Zophar starts off immediately with an accusation. Verses 2 through 3, he attacks Job as one who uses words to cover up his own guilt. He says, you use a multitude of words and you babble to overcome other men's wisdom. In other words, you're trying to tire us out just by saying a bunch of things. And this causes Zophar to see Job as someone who is mocking true wisdom so that in the end he believes that someone should shame Job into submission in verse 3. And to set up the shaming of Job, Zophar then quotes what he believes to be Job's position in verse 4. He says, "For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes." The problem with this statement as a summation of Job's position is that it sounds correct, but it's fundamentally misleading from what Job has actually said. Because if you go back through the dialogues and you look at how Job describes himself, Job consistently uses the word blameless. And contextually within Job's speeches, he's not saying that he does not sin, but what he's saying is that I'm blameless of any act that would have caused God to treat me in this way. Zophar, though, says and claims Job's position as saying that he is clean in God's eyes. And what we miss in English is that the word that's used in Hebrew there has the connotation of pure, holy, spotless, implying that Zophar is saying that Job's position is not that he's blameless of any act that causes this, but that Job is saying, no, I'm perfectly holy and sinless. And in response to that false position, Zophar wishes that God would reveal his wisdom to Job and prompt true understanding in him in verses 5 through 6. And the content of that wisdom is Zophar's main contention against Job. Job, you actually deserve more punishment than you've already received. That's the last half of verse 6. And there's a lot to unpack there. Because first, Zophar is the first friend to conclusively say to Job, you're getting what you deserve. You have to be in the wrong. And the second thing is, you start to get a sense of the arrogance of Zophar's theology. Because just prior to this, what has he told Job? He said that God has the secrets of wisdom, things that are hidden that you don't understand, that I don't understand, things that he would have to reveal to you. And yet, what does Zophar turn around and say to Job? Guess what? I got the inside scoop. I know all the things you don't. Let me tell you what God really thinks. It's from this that Zophar then moves to extolling God's wisdom in an attempt to challenge Job's claim that God has treated him wrongly. And he describes the wisdom of God as surpassing human understanding, verses 7 through 9. It extends beyond any limits we can impose on it, from the deeps to the highest heaven, from the limits of the grave or the earth or the sea. In verse 10, in that wisdom, God is able to rule and do as he wishes without contest. God judges wisely, and so if he imprisons or afflicts a man, who are we to say that he's done wrong? He infallibly knows who the wicked are. He will always deal with them according to their sin in verse 11. And to support that kind of contention and to denigrate Job, Zophar deploys a proverb in verse 12. But a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. In other words, he's saying to Job, you're foolish, and your search for answers is not going to make you any wiser, but only stupider, because you have no chance of changing who or what you are with the tack that you're on. And so to encourage Job to take on his position, to agree with him, Zophar then paints a picture of the fate of those who repent. And he tells Job, first, you have to repent and put away the sins that have led to this point, verses 13 and 14. If he does this, he'll be able to lift up his face before God without fear. Verses 16 through 17, this will then lead Job to forgetting his misery and being led out of the darkness of his soul. And finally, Job will be able to have peace and security and rest in verse 19. That's kind of the final prod to Job. He looks up and says, and if you don't do these things, here's what's going to end up to the wicked man. Their fate is threefold. Their eyes will fail. They will have no means of escape. And any hope for release from their misery will be destroyed. And while Zophar offers up that description of the wicked at the end in kind of broad generalities, saying, this is the wicked man, contextually, what's he doing? Job, hey, guess what happens to the wicked man? And so he's looking directly at him. Job's response to Zophar serves both to rebut Zophar's position, but it also serves as a capstone of that entire first cycle of speeches. Because yes, he's talking to Zophar, but he's also looking at the other two friends as well. And in effect, he's going to look at him and say, your system's wrong. It doesn't work. And in this, he departs somewhat from his other cycles of speeches, because generally what we've seen Job do is he'll complain about his friends. You guys are lousy comforters. He'll state his own innocence. He'll appeal to God for some sort of mediator or somebody to stand in the gap, and then he usually goes into lament. And here he breaks that cycle. Here he looks at them and goes, no, everything you've said doesn't make sense. The theology you're taking on, the things that you're saying, don't work. Your system's bankrupt, it's destructive, it's easily disproved by common experience. And so he begins in chapter 12 with biting sarcasm regarding his friends, verses 2 and 3. Flip the page. No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. You're going to put that in modern parlance? You guys have got it all nailed down. No one else is ever going to be as smart as you are. And he looks at them and says, you're not telling me anything new. Verse 3, who does not know such things as these? In other words, the positions you're holding aren't great revelations. Other people have been teaching this. You guys have appealed to tradition, to mystical experience, common ways that people say that the world works. We all know that you think this is the case. However, Job has his own set of evidence to countermand the propositions, and that's himself. Verse 4, he says, I'm the one who's called out to God. I am the one who's blameless. I have not done anything to deserve this. And yet, I'm also the one who's been made a laughingstock, who's mocked by his friends, who's been brought to this low point. I'm the one that breaks your system. I'm the one that proves that it's wrong. And he looks at them and says, rather than showing compassion to me for this reality, you've instead acted like those who have no troubles, and when somebody else becomes an object of trouble, you mock them and you show contempt for them in verse 5. Most problematically for his friends, their beliefs are shown to be false also by common experience. Verse 6, he says, those who provoke God by committing injustice routinely get away with it. Not only do I break the mold of your system, so do all the wicked people out there in the world. He describes their tense as being at peace, and though they provoke God, they're still living in security. He then looks around and he says, look, creation itself can show that God rules as sovereign over all, so that the wicked and the righteous are in their states that they're in because of God. And he appeals to the created order. He says, look at the beasts of the field, look at the bushes, look at the birds. All of them can recognize this. Verse 9, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In verse 10, then he gives a rhetorical point to drive home that if the beasts of the field can recognize this, then why can't his friends recognize that it's God's sovereign rule that allows the wicked to prosper and the righteous to suffer? Verse 10, in his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. And he thinks that this should be easily discernible to them, just as the hearing or the tasting of food is, especially since verse 12, they're supposed to be among the aged in which wisdom resides. Verses 13 through 25 then serve as an extended description of how God's sovereignty is uncontested and works in ways that often do not make sense to us. God is the one who does as he wishes. He tears down and builds up as he sees fit in verses 13 through 15. Within the scope of his power, both the wicked and the righteous in verse 16. In his sovereignty, he upends what we think should be the natural order of things, 17 through 25. The mighty, those who are counselors, kings, princes, judges, are brought low. Nations are exalted and then overthrown. Counselors and the wise are made foolish. All of these are confounded and made to stagger under God's might, power, and sovereignty. Chapter 13, then verses 1 through 12, Job actually starts to really light into his friends' beliefs and their conclusions. And his appeal for his statements is what he sees happening around him. Verse 1, behold, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. And he says, verse 2, if I can get it, then so should you, because I'm not inferior to you in wisdom. And it's for this reason in verse 3 that Job sees the need to appeal to God to make his case. Their system is fundamentally bankrupt. It leads nowhere. So Job needs the clarity that would come from contending with God for why God has put him in this position. To this he adds that their counsel is worthless because it glosses over the hard realities of life. Verse 4, as for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Again, he goes, your system is horrible. It's like trying to polish a turd, and you're doing a bad job of it. It would be better for them to remain silent rather than try to argue as if they had the wisdom that belongs to God in verses 7 through 12. Because in trying to buttress their own systems, they're showing that they're speaking falsely, verse 7, and they're showing the favoritism towards their own conclusions in verse 8. This will only lead to judgment on their part when God finally reveals the truth, verses 9 through 11. Job then looks at him and says, I need to appeal to God. But I also understand that in making that appeal, it's dangerous for me. I'm stepping out into a risky proposition here. Because he knows, verse 14, that contending with God could lead to his destruction. And yet, even though God could slay him for his temerity in making the challenge, Job's only hope for vindication is that he seeks justice before God in verse 15. And he looks at his friends and says, and if that were the case, even if I should be slain for making the case, if God would let me stand in his presence and make it, I would be vindicated. I know that I would be in the right, because God cannot let the wicked into his presence. And so by allowing me here, he's saying he's righteous. And this prompts him to once again to appeal to God that his cases be heard in verses 18 through 28. He appeals to his own innocence. He asserts it. He says, who is there who will contend with me? Verse 19. The answer being, no one. No one can actually say that I'm not righteous, that I'm not blameless before God in this. However, if God should contend against him and say, no, you are in the wrong, Job says, okay, fine. I would accept that and I would stay silent. And he looks at God and he says, in this, do two things for me so that we can have this contest, so that I can talk to you, so that we can appeal this case. He says, first, relent from my punishment. Verse 21, the first half, withdraw your hand far from me. Give me a break. Let me catch my breath. And then second, that he would not be terrified at the dread presence of God. Last half of verse 21, let not your dread terrify me. And he looks at God and he says, if you can do that, and we can appeal this case, then instruct me. If I've done something wrong, what sins have I committed? Why have you turned away from me? Why have you terrified and pursued me to the point of destruction? And it's at this point that Job seems to be hit with his own sense of mortality and the frailty of humanity in general. Verse 28 of chapter 13 through verse 6 of chapter 14. Because he looks around and he says, man is born into troubles. He seems to wither under the onslaught of them. He's like a flower that springs up and then withers and dies. And against that frailty and weakness, how can a man hope to actually contend against God? Man's only hope, since God has ultimate control of his life, is to hope that God leaves him alone so that he can eke out whatever minor pleasures that he can, like a day laborer who works all day, toils, and breaks his body for the simple pleasure of going home at night to rest on his bed. But he's not content with that state of affairs. He looks and goes, this is the way it feels. This is the way it seems. Man is frail. It's hopeless. God just needs to leave us alone. And then he looks at it and goes, but that's not right. He begins with an analogy to a tree that is cut down and left as a stump. Because even as that tree is cut down and left for dead, He says it can come back to life. It can sense water in the ground. It can cause a new root to spring up. It can cause it to bud again. And he contrasts that with man who dies and is brought down, verses 10 through 12. And Job prays that God would somehow preserve him, even in Sheol, until that point where God's wrath abates and Job can once again be brought forth and stand before his Creator in right relationship. And it's in this hope that Job sees relief, that God would relent into his judgment and would no longer hold Job's sin against him, that Job could be restored to right relationship with God in verses 15 through 17. And yet in all that, he still feels the overpowering crush of God's anger. Because he's still looking around and saying, look at where I'm at. And he compares that feeling of God's weight of judgment against him as being like the crushing power of nature that wears down even the strongest of mountains. And he says, against that judgment, man can only pass away. All he can know is the pains that are inflicted on him. Job 20. Beginning with the second of Zophar's speeches. Then Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, therefore my thoughts answer me because of my haste within me. I hear censure that insults me, and out of my understanding a spirit answers me. Do you not know this from of old, since man was placed on earth, that the exalting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless but for a moment? Though his height mount up to the heavens and his head reach the clouds, he will perish forever like his own dung. Those who have seen him will say, where is he? He will fly away like a dream and not be found. He will be chased away like a vision of the night. The eye that saw him will see him no more, nor will his place any more behold him. His children will seek the favor of the poor, and his hands will give back his wealth. His bones are full of his youthful vigor, but it will lie down with him in the dust. Though evil is sweet in his mouth, though he hides it under his tongue, though he is loath to let it go and holds it in his mouth, yet his food is turned in his stomach. It is the venom of cobras within him. He swallows down riches and vomits them up again. God casts them out of his belly. He will suck the poison of cobras. The tongue of a viper will kill him. He will not look upon the rivers, the streams flowing with honey and curds. He will give back the fruit of his toil and will not swallow it down. From the profit of his trading, he will get no enjoyment. For he has crushed and abandoned the poor. He has seized a house that he did not build. Because he knew no contentment in his belly, he will not let anything in which he delights escape him. There was nothing left after he had eaten, therefore his prosperity will not endure. In the fullness of his sufficiency, he will be in distress. The hand of everyone in misery will come against him. To fill his belly to the full, God will send his burning anger against him and rain it upon him into his body. He will flee from an iron weapon. A bronze arrow will strike him down. It is drawn forth and comes out of his body. The glittering point comes out of his gallbladder. Terror comes upon him. Utter darkness is laid up for his treasures. A fire not fanned will devour him. What is left in his tent will be consumed. The heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The possessions of his house will be carried away, dragged off in the day of God's wrath. This is the wicked man's portion from God, the heritage decreed for him by God. Then Job answered and said, keep listening to my words, and let this be your comfort. Bear with me, and I will speak, and after I have spoken, mock on. As for me, is my complaint against man? Why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be appalled, and lay your hand over your mouth. When I remember, I am dismayed, and shuddering seizes my flesh. Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their offspring are established in their presence, and their descendants before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear. No rod of God is upon them. Their bull breeds without fail. Their cows calve and do not miscarry. They send out their little boys like a flock, and their children dance. They sing to the tambourine and the lyre, and rejoice to the sound of the pipe. They spend their days in prosperity, and in peace they go down to Sheol. They say to God, depart from us. We do not desire the knowledge of your ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we get if we pray to him? Behold, is not their prosperity in their hand? The counsel of the wicked is far from me. How often is it that the lamp of the wicked is put out, that their calamity comes upon them, that God distributes pain in his anger, that they are like the straw before the wind and like chaff and the storm carries away? You say, God stores up their iniquity for their children. Let him pay it to them that they may know it. Let their own eyes see their destruction, and let them drink of the wrath of the Almighty. For what do they care of their houses after them? For what do they care for their houses after them when the number of their months is cut off? Will any teach knowledge, saying that he judges? Will any teach God knowledge, saying that he judges those who are on high? One dies in his full vigor, being wholly at ease and secure, his pails full of milk, and the marrow of his bones moist. Another dies in bitterness of soul, never having tasted prosperity. They lie down alike in the dust, and the worms cover them. Behold, I know your thoughts, and your schemes to wrong me. For you say, where is the house of the prince? Where is the tent in which the wicked lived? Have you not asked those who travel the roads, and do you not accept their testimony? That the evil man is spared in the day of calamity, that he is rescued in the day of wrath. Who declares his way to his face, and who repays him for what he has done? When he is carried to the grave, watch is kept over his tomb. The clods of the valley are sweet to him. All mankind follows after him, and those who go before him are innumerable. How then will you comfort me with empty nothings? There is nothing left of your answers but falsehood. Zophar's second speech comes as a direct response to Job's assertion in chapter 19 that he is confident that he will be vindicated by God. And Zophar very clearly takes umbrage at the fact that Job has denied their counsel and considers them liable for judgment at the end of chapter 19, verses 28 and 29. And so this is why in verse 3 he says, I hear censure that insults me. In other words, Job, you have done nothing but deny wise counsel and insulted us by your refusal to take it. And so I'm going to give you some learning. And so his response to Job rests again on his belief that the wicked and the righteous receive their just rewards quickly in this life. Verses 4 and 5, do you not know this from of old? Since man was placed on the earth, that the exalting of the wicked is short and the joy of the godless but for a moment. What then follows in verses 6 through 29 is a vivid description of how God will destroy the wicked in the here and now. And he says, verses 6 and 7, while the wicked may appear to rise to the highest heights, their downfall will be great. They will be flushed away like so much waste. It says they're like their own dung. You flush it down, it goes away. All those who saw their glory will see their downfall. They'll see the after effects ripple out, not only to them, but also to their children in verses 8 through 10. He says that their prosperity will pass like a dream, that their children are going to be forced to beg from the very people that they exploited to get to their position. And though their evil will seem to provide riches and benefits, he says it's sweet in their mouth, verse 12. Ultimately, it's going to be poison to them in verses 14 through 16. No benefits will accrue to them. They'll be forced to give back all that they've exploited from the weak and the poor. And while he seemingly has everything that he needs, God will not sate him with pleasant things, but only with wrath and judgment, verses 20 through 23. He says God will come against him like a warrior, striking him with a sword and an arrow. And he gives us vivid imagery of the sword actually piercing through the body and breaking out so that the viscera pours from them. And all that's laid up by his evil gain will be destroyed in God's wrath in verse 26. And then really pointing at Job directly, Zophar lays out what would actually be the case if Job got the result that he wants, which is to stand and plead his case before God. He says, because if that wicked man, you Job, were to actually stand in God's presence, before he could say anything, the heavens and the earth would rise up against him to testify before God of his wickedness, that he's getting what he deserves. And with that, the just judgment of God will be completed. What little that wicked man has left, verse 28, would be brought to desolation along with him. He says, such is the fate of the wicked man before God, and this is the only result that he can expect. Verse 29. And then Job looks at Zophar and says, yeah, I got some problems with that one. And again, the second speech by Job in response to Zophar serves as a type of capstone, contesting all of his friends' counsel. And Job's going to look and say, you're contending fundamentally at the most simple level that bad things happen to bad people right away. And he goes, you're wrong. I can prove it by the simple fact that bad things do not always happen to bad people. And so he begins in verses 2 through 3, pleading with him to actually pay attention to what he's trying to argue. He says, keep listening to my words. Bear with me and I will speak. He says, if you can do this for a brief time, after that, you're free to go ahead and keep on mocking me. But pay attention for the moment. And what they need to understand is that Job's complaint, his desire for vindication, is not relating to human beings. It's between him and God. He says, and if you understood that what I'm really desiring is restored relationship with God, you'd understand my impatience. You'd get why I want this to happen right now. And it's because of this that his friends should lay off from their false counsel and actually pay attention to what he has to say. And then Job goes about repudiating their theology by pointing out what should be patently obvious to anyone. Sometimes the wicked prosper, and they're not troubled in this life. And he breaks this down into 3 areas in which the wicked do not see trouble. First, he says, the wicked can lead happy lives, verses 7 through 16. He says, look, they have pleasant circumstances. They're not troubled by common troubles. He says, verses 7 and 8, they're going to reach an old age. They're going to see their children flourish before them. Their households prosper as God does not strike them. He says, it does not strike them with a rod. Their flocks flourish. Their bulls always breed. Their cows always give birth. And they never lose an animal. Verses 11 through 13, he says, they live lives of ease and merriment. Their children run out through the fields playing and cavorting like, little lambs playing and hopping about. And he goes, and they come back to their house in the evening, and there's joy and merriment and entertainment. And they do all this, he says, while they blatantly reject God. Verses 14 through 16, and they say explicitly, verse 14, the first half, to God, depart from us. More so, they don't see the point in fear or knowledge of God or in serving him for who he is. Rather, they look around and say, look at all the things that I have done. Look at how I've managed to create this great life. I don't need God. And they get away with it and they enjoy it. And the second area Job says is that the wicked can escape punishment. You say it has to be here and now and immediate. And he goes, no, they can get away with it. They don't only live happy lives, they keep doing what they're doing with no consequence. And Job uses language to directly rebut Bildad's assertion in 18:5 that the light of the wicked is extinguished by asking a rhetorical question in verse 17. He says, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? That their calamity comes upon them, that God distributes pains in his anger. In other words, guys, so you're saying this happens. Tell me when, where, and how. When have you actually seen this happen? And he says their fate is not to be driven about by God's wrath in verse 18. And he looks at Eliphaz and Zophar because both of them have contended in previous dialogue and said, yeah, well, even if they're not punished, their kids will be. Eliphaz says it in chapter 5, verse 4. Zophar says it in 20, verse 10. And Job says, verse 19, this is what you think. But then he looks at them and goes, but what do they care? Even if their children are punished after the fact for them, guess what? They're dead. They don't care. What does it matter to them if somebody else suffers a consequence for their sin and they get away with it? This is a fundamental failing in their belief in direct retribution. And he looks at them and says, who do you think you are to try to instruct God on how he should act towards mankind in verse 22? He says, man can either die richly blessed or in bitterness of his soul, but that has no direct correlation to his moral standing before God. And then finally, he says, the wicked live life and they're not troubled by the idea of death. What did I do? Sorry, my notes just disappeared. The joys of technology. Where are we at? Yeah. The wicked are not troubled by death, verses 27 through 33. And it's this point that Job knows that his friends are chomping at the bit, that they're ready to get back in and start digging at everything he's just said. And so he says to him, verse 27, "Behold, I know your thoughts, your schemes to wrong me." In other words, I know you're not paying attention. I know you're not actually going to listen to what I'm saying, and you're going to come back to the same attack pattern. And he also stuns that their blanket response is to say that Job's case cannot be true because the wicked have been completely eradicated from the earth. Yeah, Job, we can't give you a case study in this because, well, the wicked are gone. See, God did it. And to this, Job responds with the ancient Near East equivalent of, bro, do you even? And he says, verse 29, have you not asked those who travel the roads? Do you not accept their testimony? In other words, have you not stepped outside of your house, looked around, talked to the people that move through the world, seen how they interact with the wicked, and seen that these things happen? How blind and closeted are you? If they had, they would have to admit that the evil man is spared from calamity in verse 30. No one rebukes him in verse 31. In fact, in death, they find no trouble. He says, the clods of the valley lie sweet upon them. In other words, death and burial to them is nothing. The dirt lies easy on their soul. In fact, people memorialize them. He says, a great crowd follows after them to pay honor and to memorialize. And he looks at him and he goes, your wisdom is empty. It's worth nothing. Your system is broken. It doesn't work. Job's description of their counsel as falsehood leaves, I think, a little bit to be desired in translation from what the ESV has. Because the Hebrew word there used for falsehood has the connotation of being a violation of the sacred. It's used in Leviticus 5:15. It says, if anyone commits a breach of faith, describing someone who violates God's law. It's used in Numbers to describe somebody who violates the marriage covenant. And he looks at them and says, your system is a violation of the sacred. It violates how we understand God. It violates how we relate to him. It's worthless. So again, what do we do with all that? Well, first, and I feel like Job and his friends going back in dialogue, because I've had to feel like the same basic application for the last 3 weeks, but we just keep expanding it a little bit each time, just like they do in their dialogues. Because I've said more than once that the theology of Job's friends is destructive. But what I want to do now is I want to say we need to appreciate how a lack of nuance in our understanding of God leads to a lack of grace towards others. Because ultimately, Job's friends are trying to exist in a very black and white world in which they cannot see how God, in his infinite richness, relates to man. They want to live in a mechanistic system in which a given input always results in a given output. And their lack of willingness to wrestle with the fact that God may not relate to man in a simplistic way results in their horrendous treatment of Job. And the simple fact is that even within the modern American church, and I'd say especially within the modern American church, we can see the same simplistic understanding of God play itself out in how we see people interact. I mentioned last week that Job's friends are the equivalent to modern health and wealth teachers, assuming the fact that you leave off all the talk about judgment and just talk about do the thing and God gives you stuff. And that teaching operates on the same mechanistic view of God. Put in money and faith, get good things. Fail to, and what's going to happen? You're going to suffer. We could talk in the same way about hellfire and brimstone revivalistic methods. Terrifying people with the idea of judgment, come up, say a prayer, and suddenly you're always right before God and you don't have to worry about anything else. It's a simplistic, mechanistic view of salvation and our relationship to God. And it's abusive. We can see this also in common objections to the problem of evil. Because one of the most common is that God should only ever interact with his creation in a loving way. It should always be sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. And if he doesn't, it's not that there's something wrong with our understanding of God, it's something wrong with us, or the way that we interact with the world. It's that there's something wrong with God. And so Job's friends get it right that God has all the wisdom and the power and sovereignty, but they ignore the fact that this means God may not or does not interact with his creation in simplistic, mechanistic ways. Instead, God has deigned to operate in a way that both exposes the horrendousness of sin while also demonstrating his glory and his worthiness of worship. And this means, on the balance, that the righteous may suffer and the wicked may prosper, not because that is the correct moral ordering of the universe, but because God is using it towards his own ends. The second thing I would say is that, and again, this is just kind of an expansion of what we've talked about before, because I've said that Christians need to have a place in their theology for unjust suffering. But I would extend that and say not only do we need to have a place for it, we need to expect it. Because the expectation of the New Testament is that Christians will suffer in imitation of Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:5, for as we share abundantly in Christ's suffering, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. Notice that. You share in what? Suffering. And by sharing in the suffering, you also do what? Share in the comfort. 1 Peter 4:12 through 13, verse 17. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though some strange thing were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And we tend to take that idea of suffering as Christ suffered, and we tend to isolate it down to very specific cases and say, I'm going to suffer because Christ said that they hated him and so they'll hate me. John 15, right? And yet the suffering of Christ encompassed that which was unjust and undeserved. Christ's death on the cross was the ultimate outworking of unjust suffering. But again, what did it serve to demonstrate? The power and the glory of God in salvation. And this is how the author of Hebrews can declare that although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Not that Christ was disobedient or needed correction or that he had to learn obedience. He was perfectly obedient to the Father. But that he experienced in his humanity the cost of full, faithful obedience, even to the point of being unjustly afflicted. And as so as Christ was made to endure, because we are to live in the pattern and in the way of Christ, so should we expect to suffer. So should we look at that and go, I have to be able to understand it, but I should also expect it. Because it's shaping me into the image of Christ. And by so doing, as Christ suffered in that way to demonstrate the glory and the majesty of Christ so that we could be reconciled to worship him correctly and properly, when we suffer in that way, as 1 Peter says, we stand against the world and offer a clarion call of the power and the worthiness of God. Are there any questions? Okay, next week, we get a break. Because we do chapter 28, and chapter 28 is a hymn to wisdom. It's like in a play of Sophocles where the Greek chorus goes, hey, everything just went south. Let's take a break and review and talk about some things. That's what we get. It's going to be a little less heavy. So, all right, hey, we get to worship God in 20 minutes together as a family. It's going to be wonderful.